Cariad, welcome to Audible. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you.
To chat about your book, You're Not Alone.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm so busy putting my very bright pink drink down. That actually does look like a cocktail. I feel like we've met in Wetherspoons and I've just ordered a cheeky.
I'd love to do a
cranberry.
podcast in Wetherspoons. It'd be loud.
Well, no, it depends, doesn't it? If you went in the day. I used to work in Wetherspoons.
Did
You're
you?
absolutely dead in the day.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so maybe.
Maybe.
A bit depressing, maybe, yeah.
Now your job involves talking to lots of people who are members of the club.
Yes.
So tell me, what is this club that no one particularly wants to enter and never leaves?
Similar to Wetherspoons. You find yourself there. Yeah, so we call it the club on my podcast, the Griefcast. And it's when you have a big loss, sort of what I describe as capital G grief, and you find yourself in this club of other people who get it, who have been through something that you've been through, who understand how different your world is, how everything's turned upside down, how completely you don't recognise yourself and who you were and who you once were, and you've joined the grief club, basically.
And you joined the club quite early.
I got there early, as I say in the book. I put out the nibbles, I put a little music on, I waited for everyone to come through the door, as they inevitably will. So my dad died when I was 15 of pancreatic cancer. And so, yeah, I joined the club very early. But at that point, when I was 15, I didn't really know there was a club. I thought it was just me. I really thought like, oh, this really weird thing had happened to my family and it was very unusual. And it wasn't until I got much older and then when I started the podcast in 2016, I started talking to all these people and I realised, oh, the club is rammed. It's packed full of people. And a lot of us don't realise we're just in the club like dancing in the corner by ourselves, really sad. You don't realise, no, there's a whole room. There's a whole room for you of other people who've been through what you've been through. And so that became a really important part of the process of Griefcast and the process of writing this book. And the reason it's called You Are Not Alone, that's what I say at the end of every episode of the show, is to remind people like you are part of something that everyone else is also going through and you are not alone in what you're feeling.
And when your dad died and in the years that followed, did you ever feel a sort of worry about forgetting or like losing memories or those memories fading?
Yeah, and that's really common in grief. So I'm in the club for, 20 plus years. And I think most people in the 10 plus gang will say to you, you get to a point where it's hard to remember things, especially when you experience a great loss as a young person. So obviously I don't, the memories aren't as fresh as, when I was in my 20s. As life moves on as it does in such a pace, it can be very difficult to remember things like their voice or like how they walked into a room or just what they would have said or done in situations. And then my therapist said something really good to me once, which was, do you think you'd know what he'd say for most situations? Do you think you could, if you showed him this or told him you were doing this, what would he say? And I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. Like I know what he would have said to me for this or said to me for that. And she said, well, then you haven't completely lost him. And I was like, oh God, thank you, therapy. But that's something I try and hold, that if you really, if you were lucky enough to know someone well enough to know how they would react to situations. And obviously I'm quite privileged in that I was 15. Like there's people who are, 10 and younger when they lost a significant person. And that can be very tricky to remember.
And what do you think you've learned most, or maybe the most important thing you've learned from having all these conversations with other griefsters for your podcast?
I think the biggest thing, and the reason I wanted to write the book and the sort of ethos that, as I hope, is in the book is, and I always, I'm smiling as I say it because it sounds really bleak, but you don't get over it. And what I mean by that, because sometimes if you're not in the club, that can sound like, oh my God, what? What do you mean you don't get over it? It can sound like, oh, I wake up every day and I'm weeping. And that's not what I mean. What I mean is that when you experience capital G grief in that way, it stays with you. Sometimes you're sad, sometimes you're furious, sometimes you're depressed, sometimes you're numb. Like, that's the thing with grief. When it lands, when you get it, this mess, as I call it, the grief mess, it's every single emotion coming at you 1,000 miles an hour at the same time, which is why this idea of like 5 stages or anything being quite neat about grief is a fallacy. It's not true. Sometimes it is very boring to think, oh, here we go again, another grief wave, like, oh, and especially when you're farther down the journey like I am, and as you see it walking towards you, like, oh, here we go. But what I've learned is to welcome it. And I know that sounds strange, but I used to fight it and be like, I'm going to run as fast as possible so you do not catch me up, grief. Like, I'm not going to feel you, whatever you think you're going to do. Whereas now I think, oh, hello, grief. Yeah, I am sad about that, aren't I? I can't deny the feeling of sadness anymore. That's what grief is. Your life grows around the grief. It's not that you are expected to park that grief. It's done, I'll never think about it again. But actually what you have to do is carry it alongside with you. And that's what I've tried to explain in the book, that there's ways to make the process of carrying easier and lighter, but I can't take it away from you.
Yeah. And you mentioned the 5 stages of grief, which are not the 5 stages of grief, which are not a thing. Why are they not a thing?
So, well, they are. I mean, it's someone's theory. So this theory was written by a brilliant, brilliant woman called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969. The thing to caveat all of that with is she actually wrote this not for people who were grieving. She wrote this after working in hospitals and working with patients who were dying of a terminal illness, usually cancer. At the time in America in 1969, they weren't telling people they were dying. So they would go into hospital with their malignancy and they would give them medicine to cure them. And they didn't know this was absolutely palliative care and they were going to die. And so, you know, you'd have people saying to their family, I think I'm going to get better. And the family know they're dying. But it was all this, oh, it's worse. Don't tell them, don't tell them. And her theory said, if you tell someone who's dying of cancer that they're dying of cancer, they'll go through 5 distinct emotions: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, when you say it like that, you go, oh, that makes sense. I can understand that you go through this sort of process of, oh, I am dying, that's what's happening. And then you reach this point of, oh, okay, I can accept my death and I can die with a certain level of peace, knowing that at least I know I'm dying. So she wrote it for people who were dying. And I cannot tell you, I've no idea when it became sort of like evolved and twisted and eaten up into this idea that it was for people who were grieving. Because it makes no sense for grieving. It only works as a theory if you're offering a full stop, and the full stop is death. But grieving people don't suddenly die. We have to carry on living. So how can we ever reach this place of acceptance and everything's fine? Because I'm living still with this pain. And what's really weird about this theory is that people still believe it. They still come up to me 2023 and say, oh, Cariad, I love this show and I listen to the Griefcast, but I'm doing it wrong because I'm not doing the 5 stages and I can't get through them. And it makes me want to scream because I'm like, it's not for you. It's for someone dying of cancer in 1969 in America. That's what this was written for. We wouldn't take many books on mental health from 1969 now, or diets from 1969, women's rights from 1969. So let's allow grief to move into the future as we would those other topics.
Yeah. So what other kind of theories around grief are more helpful? You write about dual process.
Dual process is my absolute fave. I'm like a fan of dual process model. It was invented by Strober and Schutt. I still don't know if I'm saying that right. So please, Strober and Schutt, feel free to tell me that I'm getting it wrong. But they're basically 2 psychologists, psychotherapists. I'm sorry, I'm not an academic. Psychotherapists? 2 people, 2 academics who came up with this theory that what happens in grief is an oscillation between 2 states. So I'm going full academic now. So you have the grief state, which is like, you're weeping and your snot's all over your face and you can't even stand up. And you have the restoration. And that might look like you go out with friends and you forget about it, or you binge watch loads of Netflix and you don't think about it, or you just do your job and you're just trying to get on with your life. And actually what they state is you should oscillate between those 2 states. Like, that's the most helpful thing. You have a bit of grief, and then the bit where it seems like you're ignoring it, your brain is kind of processing it. When I read that, my brain exploded, because I included, and so many other people grieving, feel guilty for the restoration part. So whenever someone says to me oh, I've just not really been thinking about it, or I've been going out a lot, or, just watching telly and trying to live my life, but it must mean I've forgotten them. And now I can say, no, no, that is part of grief. That is your brain being like, we can't constantly cry about this. So let's have a break. Let's move over here. Let's give ourselves some life, a restoration activity. And it has to be genuinely restorative. I don't mean getting out and drinking your head off. That obviously is not restorative, however much fun it might be. So that side of kind of forgetting about it and processing it, and then going back to the weeping and the snotting and the wailing, and you kind of go between the 2. And that's completely normal. And that is how a human brain processes a loss. And that for me is just a game-changing theory because it takes away all the guilt and the shame of not doing grief correctly or in the right order or not reaching this place where you feel fine. It's like you're never going to be completely okay that someone died, but you will oscillate between the two of them. And what happens with long grief, so I'm 20 plus years, I would say I oscillate between those states, every 2 or 3 years I might go back to having a bit of a weep about it, but much less than I used to. The first year, you're like every 5 minutes, you're just weeping and then laughing and then weeping. So it's important for people to realise like this process is lifelong, but it gets easier.
And do people experience grief differently if a loved one dies suddenly, or versus a long, drawn-out illness?
It really depends on the individual case. So obviously, yes, there's a huge difference between a shocking sudden death and, for example, like a terminal illness that, maybe they've been sick for 10 years and you've been in and out of hospitals and it's coming. But they're both grief. And that's what's important. None is better. None is like, well, that's hard because you knew it was coming, or that's harder because you didn't know. Like, none of them are better or worse. And I've had guests say, oh, I wish I'd got a phone call and I didn't have to like watch them be in pain. And I've had guests say, I wish I could have been in hospital with them and said something. And, like it always looks rosier on the other side. So what's really important to remember with grief is your grief is unique. It's completely unique to you and that person. The only difference with a sudden death is the trauma and the shock. So that's the only thing I would say is if you have a grief which, literally you get a phone call in the middle of the night, shocking, awful, is that you will probably be in shock for longer than someone who knew it was coming. And that might delay your grief. I mean, it might delay it by like a few months or it might delay it by a few years. Who knows? Depends how shocking it is. But shock can play a big part in you have to kind of get through the shock before you can meet the grief.
Yeah.
But it's still grief.
Yeah.
No one wins.
Yeah. And no one, even people who have been through grief, know what the right thing to say is to someone.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, that comes back to what we were just saying. It's completely unique. So I'm sorry for your loss is the phrase that we have in this country. Like everyone kind of knows it. Some people hate that phrase. They hate it. If you bring that up in a grief event, they're like, oh, why does anyone say that to me? Other people love it. They think, oh, it's so nice. It's really respectful. I'm really glad they said that. People are different. And if you say, I'm sorry for your loss, and they look at you and go, what? It's perfectly okay to go, I'm so sorry. It's the only phrase I've got. And I don't think that went down very well. But I just want you to know I am trying and I'm here. I just don't really know what to say. Like, that's fine. If we all just start admitting, I don't really know what to say. And when I talk to people about what to say, everyone says, oh, I have all these thoughts in my head of like, oh, should I say that? Should I not? But then they don't, it's like they just stop themselves. Like, whatever's in your head, say it. I really don't know what to say to you. I know that your mum just died and I'm so sorry. And I've been racking my brain to think of something useful, but I actually can't. But I just want you to know that I think it's awful and I would love to be here for you if I can. Like, just... That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say to someone. And I think this idea that we can find a script that will work for everybody, again, is like the 5 stages. It's like, yeah, it'd be really nice if that was true. Wouldn't it be lovely? Wouldn't it be great if grief didn't work like any other aspect of human interaction and there was a script that worked? It's like, oh, this is the line that will pick up every guy or gal that you like in a bar. Like, this will work every time. We know it never does. So stop looking for an easy way to talk about it. There isn't one. All you can do is try.
Yeah. And maybe this falls into the same category, but for someone grieving, do you have any thoughts on how they can deal with other people's awkwardness when they're already trying to deal with the grief?
Yeah, it's really hard. And I think not everyone's going to get it right. Like, they're just not. And people will say really stupid things. And I try and place in my category in my head of like, okay, do I love this person and they said a stupid thing? No, I barely know them. Okay, I barely know them. They said a stupid thing. I probably will try and avoid them for the rest of my life in some way. Or I won't have an emotional conversation with them. Do you know what I mean? Like, I will, I'm sure I'll talk, I'll shoot the breeze with you, but I'm never really going to bring up grief for my dad because you said this thing that was like really awkward. And you just sort of learn. And that's what I think you have to protect yourself a little bit and just try and, every time you have those conversations, it's a bit of a value judgment. Does this person get it? Are they in the club? How am I today? Is it an anniversary? Am I going to bawl my eyes out if I even start talking about it? Or actually, is it okay? And I think I could talk about it. And again, don't be afraid to say what's in your head. It's all right to say to someone, oh, it's actually a really tricky day today. So thank you so much for asking about him. But I just don't want to talk about it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And what will happen, this is what we don't want, will be like 4 seconds of, oh. And then we can just bear that. If you can just like sit through the 4 seconds where you're like, oh, I asked and they just said no. And go, okay, yeah, sure. It's fine. You just got to ride out those 4 seconds. And I promise you, then you'll reach the other side. And that grieving person will remember you asked, will remember you tried, and will be so grateful and will say to you probably 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, thank you, by the way, for asking. I just couldn't talk about it at that point. I was too sad, but I really appreciated that you asked. Like, it stayed with me.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts on being really messy with the mess of grief in public or at work?
Oh, well, it's very unique, you know, individual experience. Like, obviously, if you like, I don't know, work in McDonald's and you're sobbing your eyes out as people are ordering, like, they might have a problem with it. I think what we lack in this country is, it comes back to this time thing that we've talked about. I think if someone burst into tears and you said, what's wrong? And they said, oh, my mum just died. I think everyone would be like, oh, God, oh my, get her a tissue. Of course. Oh, have a cup of tea. Oh, awful. Yeah. I think if someone burst into tears and said, my mum died 10 years ago, all right, why is she crying? Why is she crying? What do we do? Because we want to believe it would be packed away by now. So I think what we need to get better at is people expressing a sadness past the 2-year cutoff point, which is kind of what we give everybody.
Yeah.
And being like, yeah, they might still be sad 2 years on. They might still be sad 10 years on. It doesn't mean you need to fix it. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. It doesn't mean that like they haven't processed it or they need therapy. They're just still sad about something. And again, if you can sit through 4 seconds of like, I really want them to stop crying, but I'm going to try not to make them stop crying, and just be like, that sounds really awful. I'm so sorry.
And you mentioned before that kind of almost 2-year cut-off point that people give people. And you write about the Victorians and some of the kind of grieving ideals that we've kept from them. So if you had to keep something from Victorian ideals of grieving and get rid of something, what would you keep and get rid of?
Yeah, I mean, the Victorians, like, they set the gold standard for grief. You know, they really went there. They made it an industry. Literally, they had, like, grief shops you could go and buy your complete uniform in. So hats off to them. Top black hats off to them for their, you know, inventions. I think the thing that they did well was the celebration of grief and the acknowledgement of it. So they had the black armbands. They had, like, a black bow on the door. Oh, you know, you would wear black. Obviously, a bit much, not everyone wants to do that. But the idea that you could wear a black armband for a certain amount of time and that people would know, oh, they've lost someone. Like, that's incredible. We don't have that. We have no way of signalling, you know, like a baby on board badge or like I can't wear a mask thing that we had during the pandemic. Like, we have no way of signalling, I'm currently in grief. Don't bump into me. If you ask me something, I'm going to start crying. Like, if you're kind to me, I'm going to start crying. So I think when I think of what it was like to be able to wear something on your arm that was like, I just know someone who's died, that must have been such a freeing experience to know that the world is going to respect that. However, what I wouldn't take is how strict they were, because they were the ones that really set the date of like a widow basically had 2 years to be in full mourning, and then, you know, then you had 6 months of like half mourning and quarter mourning, and like you went from like black to purple to grey, you were allowed to wear. And even if you got married in that time, remarried, you'd then be allowed to get married, and then the next day you should go back into your mourning clothes for the first husband. How awkward. I mean, like, I'm still sad about Billy. Remember Billy, my first husband? He was really great. You're fine, you're here. You're alive for now. So I think that they were very strict on timelines, and they really did expect after that timeline, done. And they had like, you know, there was a certain amount of grieving for like a first cousin or a baby or a sibling or a second cousin. Like, they literally worked it out. So I think that kind of idea of like that you can put a time on grief is mad. It's absolute madness. You can't. And for some people, 2 years is enough. And for some people, after 2 years, they will feel fine. But for lots of people, they won't. And that's what we need to be kind to, make space for, that if somebody doesn't fit the timeline, they're not wrong, they're not weird or odd, or they're not doing grief incorrectly. That's just how they feel.
And how did you find narrating the book?
A mix. I love doing audio stuff. I love done audiobooks that are not my own books. I love doing it. But yeah, reading my grief memories was interesting, shall we say, and tough. Having written some really painful stuff about the beginning of my grief journey, to then have to read it out loud, I was like,
Yeah.
oh God. So, but what I tried to think was, well, someone listening to this isn't going to expect you to not be upset. So it's okay if you sound upset, because they'll be listening to what you're saying, which is upsetting stuff. But the rest of the stuff, the more fun stuff, and I should say I tried to make the book a mixture of those things, so that when you read it, I don't want you to read this book and go, oh my God, grief is so awful. I want you to have some moments where you think, God, grief's so awful, and other moments you're like, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know grief could do that. And hopefully every time you're putting it down, feeling just like a smidge lighter about your own grief.
Well, I really loved it.
Thank you.
I would say I'm currently knocking on the door of the club.
Okay, sure. You're peeking in. You're not in yet. Yeah.
And really hoping that no one lets me in,
No,
even though
we
I know
won't.
they will very soon.
Yeah.
So yeah, reading it for me was really useful. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.